All right, everybody, welcome back to the second part of diagnosing conflict in relational leadership. My name is Marcel Tam,
I'm Callie Johnson.
and we're going to walk you through the next part of how to diagnose conflict. As a reminder of where we have been, in the first section, we talked about defining what is conflict. We talked about picking a conflict scenario that is an interpersonal level of conflict, something that's significant enough to you, that's having enough impact and happening frequently enough that is. And then choosing a conflict where you're able to approach it with a relational mindset, one that incorporates a growth, an optimistic stance and a growth mindset. So we're going to run you through that conflict. Make sure you have your worksheets in front of you. So today we're going to talk about diagnosing conflict, getting deeper into the components of a conflict, and we're going to use an iceberg metaphor. When we talk about diagnosing, we really mean understanding the nature of the conflict better, what's actually going on under the surface, so that we're better able to transform it.
Often it's really easy to want to immediately leap into problem-solving mode, but taking the time to really understand what we think might be happening in the situation is an important part of transforming the conflict that we're in. If you think back to the session that Andrew taught about teaming, he talked about the difference between analytical problem solving versus creative problem solving. And in most situations that we're in where there's conflict, the reality is that those situations require creative problem solving skills because there's not one right answer. And so today we're going to talk about steps to help reflect on and diagnose conflict.
So we're going to use an iceberg metaphor as a metaphor for looking at the parts of a conflict. So the first part I want to draw your attention to is the top of the iceberg, the part that's above the water, the thing that we can see, and that's describing what are the actions, behaviors, the words, the movements that we observe, the things that we can see, the things that we can hear. The second part is the things that lie underneath the surface of the water, which, as we know, is the majority of the iceberg. So those are all the things that motivate the behaviors that we experience in other people. What are their past experiences? What's the context of what's going on? What are their needs? What are their underlying motivations? The third part of this iceberg metaphor is the water. The water, it acts as a barrier to seeing what's actually below the surface. And those are the things that we hold. Those are the beliefs, the assumptions that we hold about the other person. And those are the stories that we tell about what we think is going on underneath the surface based on what we see above the surface.
If you recall my example of my conflict with Rick, and we think about this iceberg metaphor, what I heard was that a critical technical deliverable was not in process. In fact, it hadn't even started. And I knew how important that technical deliverable was to meeting the objectives of our project. And what I started to do was tell myself stories in my head about Rick. Rick dropped the ball. Rick doesn't understand how important this project is. Rick doesn't care that he needs to make this change happen for the rest of our team.
Exactly. So today we're going to focus on those barriers, some of those stories that we tell ourselves, because that's what we can do in a conflict. That's the part that's on us. And again, this is about diagnosing the components and owning the parts that are relevant for us. So if we think about this iceberg metaphor, not only is there an iceberg that we're trying to diagnose in the other person, we also have an iceberg, right? We also have actions and behaviors and words that we say that are above the surface for the other person. And we have our own motivations and underlying judgments and context that are in our own iceberg. So we're going to take a look underneath the surface in ourselves and see what's going on. So when we encounter an event in the world, we have an observation, we see things, we hear things, and then there's a story that's created about that. And after that story, there's an emotion that comes from the story, and then we react or we act based upon that story and that emotion. So that's the behavior that we see. Let's break this down a little bit. I want to focus on what our brain does in terms of observation and what are some of the barriers that might be in place there. If you've heard about the parable of the blind man and the elephant, there was a group of blind men who were asked to observe an elephant. They'd never encountered an elephant before, and they were asked to approach this elephant and report back, what is it? What is this thing? And so as you see in this picture, the blindfolded people are approaching an elephant. One person sitting on top of the elephant and examining the ears, and they say, "It's a fan." Another person down at the legs and feeling the circumference of the legs and the thickness and the solidity. "It's a tree," they said. Another person at the front of the elephant examining the tusk and noticing the sharpness and the solidness of that tusk, and they say, "It's a spear," and so forth for the other blind folks in this picture. Now, what they're describing, right, is that we can all experience the same thing, the same event, but have different experiences based on that. We each have our own unique stories that we tell about the objective material realities that we experience in our world. And as you can see from this picture, people have vastly different stories around this elephant. It's a fan, it's a wall, it's a tree, it's a rope, and it's actually an elephant. So similarly, our perception of the world can be influenced by the scope of what we can actually experience in the world. Are we touching the ear? Are we touching the tusk? Are we touching the tail? So on your worksheet, think about your conflict. What are the observables? What are the things above the surface of that iceberg that you can observe as objectively as you can, knowing that we are, as humans, fundamentally subjective? What are you doing? What's the other person doing? What did they say? What did you say?
Like, get really specific on what is the action or behavior. Being disrespectful is not an action or a behavior. That's the meaning making that you're processing internally. Be concrete. So if it's somebody's interrupting or speaking over somebody else, those are some specific examples that you then in turn made meaning as that's a disrespectful behavior.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that we're observing, oh, Rick's a jerk. Oh, Rick is lazy. Those are not observations. Those are already stories that we're telling and judgments that we're making. Thank you, Callie. Pause the video now and just write some of those thoughts down. All right, welcome back. We're going to continue our journey along the iceberg, and we're going to jump over to the emotions. Now, when we have responses to moments of stress, and stress is when there is that mismatch and misalignment between our thoughts, our beliefs, and our values, that conflict that happens, there can be two types of stress responses. One is that reactive type, when we experience that direct challenge to our survival. That's, the lack of food, the lack of safety. And that's the tiger jumping out of the bushes that people always talk about. That's called a reactive stress response. The second type, which is actually a lot more common, a lot more frequent, is actually what we're focusing on today, is called an anticipatory stress response. So that's where our brain is picking up on subtle signals in the environment and starting to anticipate the threat, anticipate the possible risk to our lives, and it actually starts responding in that way, and responds in such a way that we actually feel that the threat is real, the threat is happening right now. And so in Callie, in your story, for example, the deadline had not yet been met, but you were already starting to feel that anticipation of a threat to your livelihood, to your job.
You're right, Marcel. I was really panicking because I knew that we were not going to be able to meet our timelines and the implications of that. And I think that is such a good example of how those feelings that we're having are the really alarm bells for our systems. When we're experiencing those bad emotions, bad feelings, those are telling us that our needs are not being met, and often are good indicators that we're in some kind of conflict.
Exactly. And so when we're in that stress response, that comes as fight, flight, or freeze. That anticipatory stress or that reactive stress, they'll both show up as fight, flight, and freeze. And fighting is when we believe that there's a chance that we could win, the chance that we could defeat the tiger, a chance that we could actually compete and, make that deadline. And so that will show up as controlling behavior or labeling. Say you're wrong or you're a jerk. Things that we believe we hold a higher ground and we're able to win. Flight is the other way. We know we're going to lose. Let's get out of here. So we'll avoid the conflict. We won't respond to the email. Then freeze is that withdrawing and that disengagement. And so we're offering this to you just as a reminder to notice that in yourself. Am I experiencing an anticipatory stress response in this conflict? Am I in fight mode? Am I in flight mode? Am I in freeze mode? And we want to offer that to you just as a little flag to notice that I'm in a stress response. So that's another way of diagnosing if there might be a barrier in place that limits your ability to objectively experience the conflict and be in a relational mindset. This gets back to the notion of psychological safety. So if we're feeling psychologically unsafe, right, which psychologically safety is defined as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. So if I don't feel safe going into this uncertain situation and taking a risk because I am in an anticipatory stress response, then I don't feel I'm not in psychological safety, and I'm not in a relational mindset. Similarly, we want to be thinking about the other person in the conflict. Are they potentially feeling psychologically unsafe as well? Do you notice that stress response in them? Are they in a fight mode? Or are they in a flight mode? Or are they in a freeze mode? Do they look engaged or they look detached? Those types of things. And that's a good way of starting your diagnosis of looking at where is our baseline in this conflict and how able are we to engage in a relational mindset with an optimistic stance for one another, myself and the other person.
I just want to add, Marcel, that when we're seeing signs of fight, when people are actively either arguing back their points or outwardly expressing some sort of passion about what the conflict is about, that means that those people have some degree of hope that their needs are eventually going to be met. And you think about different power dynamics in the workplace, when you're experiencing or noticing when people are freezing or leaving the conversation altogether, that means that people don't feel like their needs are going to be met. And that's an important part of noticing in order to move past the storming phase in a team to something perhaps more productive. And so encourage folks to pay attention to that as well.
Thank you, Callie. So this is another chance to go to your worksheet, go under the section that says underlying issues. So those are things below the surface in an iceberg. And for yourself, look at what's going on underneath that surface. Think about your past experiences with this person or the situation. What's the current context? What are other pressures? What are the emotions that you feel? Are you in an anticipatory stress response? And what is it that you need in this situation to feel that psychological safety and enter into a relational mindset? So we'll give you a chance to fill out that part of the worksheet now. You can pause the video and then we'll come back. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue along the journey, and now we're going to focus on the story part of the process. You know, when our brain is trying to make a meaning out of the observations that it has, there's a lot of things that come into play. I'm going to start out by looking at this circle as a very simple observation for our brain, and so this is called the Ebbinghaus illusion. So look at this circle. I'm going to make another one. You can see that they're exactly the same copies of one another. And then we're going to add in a little bit of context and see what our brains do with that. So let's check this out. Okay. So notice we added a little bit of context to the left circle, a little bit of context for the brain in the right circle, and what happened? What does your brain perceive here? Chances are, like most of us other brains, your brain thought that the left circle is smaller than the right circle. I'm talking about the orange circles. And that's because of this context. So if we look again, I'm going to highlight that left circle, compare it to the right, same size. We'll take away the context. Sure enough, now our brain perceives them as the size again. So all that's to highlight that context matters for our brain. That's the way it works. It matters not just the isolated stimulus, but what's the relationship of that thing to the things around it. So that's our brain is relational. And so carry all of these lenses that alter our very perception. We carry identities, we carry culture, and we carry a context for our conflict or whatever scenario. And those are perception and influence the way we behave. All of those beliefs, biases, assumptions play a factor in the way that our brain perceives the world and responds to the world.
Okay, so now it's time to pull out your worksheet, and there's 2 questions that we want you to take a few minutes to reflect on related to barriers and what's clouding your vision. The first question is, how do you think your identity and the culture you are operating in may be contributing to how you perceive the situation and how you've tried to handle it? And the second question is really getting at psychological safety. Do you feel safe to speak up in this situation? Does the other party who you're in conflict with? And how do you know? This might also be where you're noticing, are you fighting or flighting or freezing? Or are other folks doing the same?
Okay, and welcome back. That wraps up this portion of the diagnosing conflict session. Remember that for this worksheet, you want to bring it to the live session next week. We're going to build on that conflict scenario that you've been diagnosing, and we're going to start out how do we communicate through that conflict using difficult conversations, a framework that we've adapted to transform that conflict and to move through that storming phase on your team and to realize the transformation that can be possible in conflict. We look forward to seeing you soon, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks. See you later.